Well, certainly the Srebrenica massacre did lead to the first ever international prosecution for the crime of genocide, or even though the UN Convention on Genocide has been in existence since 1948. So to that extent, yes, it was a significant step forward for international law and the notion of accountability. It was not just General Mladic, it was his deputy, General Kristic, who was also in command on that day, who was the first person to be convicted for genocide. And of course, the political mastermind, Radovan Karadzic, has also now finally faced his day in justice. So you could argue, at least in terms of the responsibility to protect an international human rights law and the willingness of the international community to go after these terrible war criminals, this disaster, this catastrophe at Srebrenica, at least had a more positive follow-up.
What was your experience at the time?
Well, as NATO spokesman at the time, I felt a terrible sense that this could and should have been prevented because it was clear that these are so-called UN safe areas where the UN forces were meant to protect civilians, Bosniak civilians trapped inside these cities, that this was not sustainable and it could lead to a massacre. And my sense is, with the NATO aircraft in the region at the time, with the UN troops, the international community should have at least laid down some kind of red line to the Bosnian Serb forces not to go into these areas and not to commit the massacres, and some kind of force, even though it was risky, was worth using to prevent this. For example, a few years later on, NATO did lay down these red lines in Kosovo with a much more rapid intervention and with a loss of life in Kosovo, which is 1/10 the number of people who lost their lives in Bosnia. So in a way, it was a failure of prevention. And in hindsight, even if maybe some of the deaths could not have been prevented, the international community should have acted much earlier.
Looking back now, 24 years on, do you see this as, you could argue, the UN's darkest hour?
Well, it certainly was, and to his great credit, the late and great UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who was responsible at the time for the former Yugoslavia in the UN, he then afterwards published an extremely candid, by UN standards, honest report on what had gone wrong, the over-ambitious mandates, the under-resourcing of the missions, although, of course, it's the nations that provide the troops, not the UN. And that led to significant reforms of UN peacekeeping, which arguably today is making UN peacekeeping in places like Africa better planned, better resourced, better supported by the international community, much more effective. So I think, yes, the UN, as well as NATO, did draw the lessons. And as I said, the Kosovo campaign 4 years later, although not perfect, at least dramatically reduced the loss of life that we'd seen previously in Bosnia.